The foreign policy of the Russian Empire covers Russian foreign relations down to 1917. All the main decisions in Russia were made by the tsar, so there was a uniformity of policy and a forcefulness during the long regimes of powerful leaders such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. However, there were numerous weak tsars such as children with a regent in control, as well as numerous plots and assassinations. With weak tsars a rapid turnover, there was unpredictability and even chaos. The most famous example came when in 1762, during the 7 Years' War, Empress Elizabeth had almost destroyed Frederick the Great of Prussia, and then she suddenly died. The new Tsar was a friend of Frederick, who unexpectedly survived. He called it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Strategy, geographical expansion by warfare and treaty was the central strategy of Russian foreign policy from the small Muscovite state of the 16th century, down to the First World War in 1914. The Tsarist goals were territory, warm water ports, and protection of Orthodox Christianity. The main weapon was a very large and increasingly well-trained army, although the domestic economy was hard-pressed to provide adequate support. Although there were occasional defeats and setbacks, the record was generally successful down to 1900. West Poland and the Baltic expansion occurred in 4 geographical areas in every direction. To the northwest, Russia engaged in a century-long struggle against Sweden for control of the Baltic, succeeded by the 1720s, obtaining not just access to the sea but ownership of Finland and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. To the west, there were a series of wars with Poland and Lithuania, followed by negotiated settlements with Prussia and Austria that gave Russia control of most of Ukraine and a large slice of Poland. Napoleon challenged the Russians directly with his famous invasion 1812, that proved to be one of the greatest military mistakes in world history. Russia seized more territory and became a world power, with a strong voice in the affairs of Europe from 1814 to the 1840s. South Ottomans and the Caucasus to the south. The conflict with the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, lasted for centuries. Russia sliced away had previously Ottoman-held territories, such as the Crimea, and became a the powerful protector of Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, and also Christians in the Transcaucasus area. The greatest defeat in the history of Russian expansion came in the Crimean War, as the British and French defended the integrity of the Ottoman Empire from clients. However, the Tsars largely recovered the losses by 1870. Central Asia to the southeast. Russia seized power in large swaths of territory in Central Asia inhabited by Muslims of Turkish ethnicity, although some Russian settlers were sent into Kazakhstan. Generally, leading local elites were left in power as long as it was clear that Russia controlled foreign and military policies. Russian expansion jumped to North America, with small fur trade operations in Alaska that were sold off in 1867 when they could no longer be defended from Britain. The mainstream of expansion finally reached Afghanistan in the middle of the 19th century, leading to the Great Game with repeated wars against the Afghan tribes, and increasingly in threats and counter-threats with the British, who were determined to protect our large holdings in the Indian subcontinent. Far East, China and Japan. Finally, there was expansion to the Far East as Russian settlers moved into the mining and agricultural districts of Siberia, taking control of local tribes and building towns, mines, prison camps along the Trans-Siberian Railway. The total Siberian population was only 500,000 in 1800, but reached 9 million in 1914, of whom 1 million were criminals and political exiles. To build up a presence on the Pacific Ocean, Russia seized some 400,000 square miles of almost uninhabited territory from China in 1858 to 60. It sent in settlers and prisoners, so that its holdings from Vladivostok north along the Sea of Japan reached 310,000 in 1897. Russia established an economic role east of into the Xinjiang and Manchuria regions of China peacefully, using the Treaty of St. Petersburg, loans to the Chinese government, networks of merchants, and by building the Chinese Eastern Railway, a branch of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, through Manchuria to the ocean. Meanwhile, in the late 19th century, Japan was expanding into Manchuria and especially Korea. It proposed a deal whereby the Russians would have the predominant role in Manchuria and Japan in Korea. The Tsar, contemptuous of the inferior Japanese, bluntly refused. Japan attacked, pushing back the Russian army on the ground, and sinking the main Russian battle fleet in 1906. Japan took control of Korea and of the southern half of the Chinese Eastern Railway. Russian expansion ended. It entered the First World War to defend the Orthodox Christians in Serbia, and perhaps to gain access to the Mediterranean at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. The Russian military failed badly, as did the political and economic system. The result was two revolutions in 1917 that destroyed the Tsarist system and led to independence for the Baltic states, Poland and Ukraine, as well as other areas. After sharp fighting in a civil war with international involvement, a new regime of communism took over and established the Soviet Union. Before 1793, relations with Sweden. During the Middle Age, several wars were fought between the Swedes and Russians, and 11 wars have been fought between Russia and Sweden only since the 15th century. In these wars, superior Russian forces often outnumbered the Swedish, which however often stood their ground in battles such as those of Narva and Svensk Sund due to Sweden's capable military organization. The central theme of the 1600 to 1725 era was the struggle between Sweden and Russia for control of the Baltic, as well as territories around it. Russia was ultimately the winner, and Sweden lost its status as a major power. In 1610, the Swedish army marched into Moscow under the command of Jacob de la Gardie. From 1623 to 1709, Swedish policy, particularly under Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XII, encouraged and militarily supported Ukrainian opposition to Muscovite Russian hegemony. Gustavus Adolphus fought the Crimean War against Russia. It ended in 1617 with the Treaty of Stolbovo, which excluded Russia from the Baltic Sea. Sweden's most dramatic defeat on the battleground came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava, in an attempt to second the Ukrainian rebellion leader Mazepa. Peter the Great took control of Russia in 1695. He greatly expanded the size of Russia while gaining access to ports on the Baltic, Black, and Caspian Seas. His Russian commanders were Generals Alexander Danilovich Menshikov and Boris Sheremetev. Before Peter, Russia was largely in isolation of European affairs in terms not just of military but of economic and cultural relationships. The mysterious far-off eastern land was held in low regard. Peter saw the urgent need for access to the Baltic Sea and formed coalitions to challenge the Swedish dominance. His success transformed Russia's role and made it a player in European affairs. In 1695, Peter attacked the Turkish forces that controlled the River Don. He failed because he lacked a navy of competent engineers to conduct a siege, and had no unity of command in his forces. He quickly remedied the defects and captured Azov in 1696. In 1697 he went to Western Europe to study the latest methods of warfare. On his return in 1698 he commenced reforming the country, turning the Russian Tsardom into a modernized empire by copying models from the West Europe with the goals of a strong, professional army and navy, as well as a strong economic base. At first he relied on hired officers, especially Germans. He soon built a network of military schools in Russia to produce fresh leadership. His favorite enterprise was building a modern fleet of the sort Russia never had known. In 1700, Peter launched the Great Northern War with the Triple Alliance of Denmark, Norway, Saxony and Poland-Lithuania. They struck a threefold attack on the Swedish protectorate of Swedish Holstein, Gottorp and provinces of Livonia and Ingria. Charles won multiple victories despite being outnumbered. He defeated a much larger Russian army in 1700 at the Battle of Narva. In 1706, Swedish forces under General Carl Gustaf Rehnskiöld defeated over a combined army of Saxony and Russia at the Battle of Fraustadt. Russia was now the sole remaining hostile power. Charles's subsequent march on Moscow met with initial success, as victory followed victory, the most significant of which was the Battle of Holochin, where the smaller Swedish army routed a Russian army twice the size. The campaign ended with disaster when the Swedish army suffered heavy losses to a Russian force more than twice its size at Poltava, followed by surrender at Perevologna. Charles spent years in futile attempts to restore Swedish power. Russia was now dominant in the Baltic. Relations with Britain. 1553 to 1792. The Kingdom of England and Tsardom of Russia established relations in 1553 when English navigator Richard Chancellor arrived in Archangels, when Ivan the Terrible ruled Russia. In 1555 the Muscovy Company was established. The Muscovy Company held a monopoly over trade between England and Russia until 1698. For the 1720s, Peter invited British engineers to St. Petersburg, leading to the establishment of a small but commercially influential Anglo-Russian expatriate merchant community from 1730 to 1921. During the series of general European wars of the 18th century, the two empires found themselves as sometime allies and sometime enemies. The two states fought on the same side during War of the Austrian Succession. They were on opposite sides during 7 Years' War, although did not at any time engage in the field. Ochakov. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger was alarmed at Russian expansion in Crimea in the 1780s at the expense of his Ottoman ally. He tried to get parliamentary support for reversing it. In peace talks with the Ottomans, Russia refused to return the Kiochakov fortress. Pitt wanted to threaten military retaliation. However, Russia's ambassador Semen Vorontsov organized Pitt's enemies and launched a public opinion campaign. Pitt won the vote so narrowly that he gave up, and Vorontsov secured a renewal of the commercial treaty between Britain and Russia. Napoleonic era, 1793 to 1815. Britain. The outbreak of the French Revolution and its attendant wars temporarily united constitutionalist Britain and autocratic Russia in an ideological alliance against French republicanism. Britain and Russia attempted to halt the French, but the failure of the joint invasion of the Netherlands in 1799 precipitated a change in attitudes. The two countries were at war, with some very limited naval combat during the Anglo-Russian War. In 1812, Britain and Russia became allies against Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. They both played major cooperative roles at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815. 1815 to 1917. Foreign affairs after the Crimean War. After the Crimean War, Russia pursued cautious and well-calculated foreign policies. The Treaty of Paris, signed at the end of the Crimean War, had demilitarized the Black Sea and deprived Russia of the southern strip of Bessarabia, located at the mouth of the Danube River. The treaty gave the West European powers the nominal duty of protecting protecting Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, removing that role from Russia, which had been designated as such a protector in the 1774 Treaty of Karchak-Kainarji. The first phase of Alexander II's foreign policy had the primary goal of altering the Treaty of Paris to regain Russian naval access to the Black Sea. The foreign policy concentrated on good relations with France, Prussia, and the United States. Russian statesmen largely achieved the goal by 1870 despite opposition from Britain and Austria-Hungary. Russia revived its expansionist policies. Russian troops first moved to gain control of the Caucasus region, where the revolts of Muslim tribesmen, Chechens, Circassians, and Dagestanis had continued despite numerous Russian campaigns in the 19th century. Once the forces of Alexander Baryutinsky had captured the legendary Chechen rebel leader Shamil in 1859, the army resumed the expansion into Central Asia that had begun under Nicholas I. The capture of Tashkent was a significant victory over the Kokand Khanate, part of which was annexed in 1866. By 1867, Russian forces had captured enough territory to form the Gubernia of Turkestan, the capital of which was Tashkent. The Bukhara Khanate then lost the crucial Samarkand area to Russian forces in 1868. To avoid alarming Britain, which had strong interests in protecting nearby India, Russia left the Bukharan territories directly bordering Afghanistan and Persia nominally independent. The Central Asian Khanates retained a degree of autonomy until 1917. Russia followed the United States, Britain, and France in establishing relations with Japan, and, together with Britain and France, Russia obtained concessions from China consequent to the Second Opium War. Under the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860, China ceded to Russia extensive trading rights and regions adjacent to the Amur and Ussuri rivers and allowed Russia to begin building a port and naval base at Vladivostok. As part of the foreign policy goals in Europe, Russia initially gave guarded support to France's anti-Austrian diplomacy. A weak Franco-Russian Entente soured, however, when France backed a Polish uprising against Russian rule in 1863. Russia then aligned itself more closely with Prussia by approving the unification of Germany in exchange for a revision of the Treaty of Paris and the remilitarization of the Black Sea. These diplomatic achievements came at a London conference in 1871, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. After 1871, Germany, united under Prussian leadership, was the strongest continental power in Europe. In 1873, Germany formed the loosely knit League of the Three Emperors with Russia and Austria-Hungary to prevent them from forming an alliance with France. Nevertheless, Austro-Hungarian and Russian ambitions clashed in the Balkans, where rivalries among Slavic nationalities and anti-Ottoman sentiment seethed. In the 1870s, Russian nationalist opinion became a serious domestic factor in its support for liberating Balkan Christians from Ottoman rule and making Bulgaria and Serbia quasi-protectorates of Russia. From 1875 to 1877, the Balkan crisis escalated with the rebellion in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and insurrection in Bulgaria, which the Ottoman Turks suppressed with such great cruelty that Serbia, but none of the West European powers, declared war. In early 1877, Russia came to the rescue of beleaguered Serbia when it went to war with the Ottoman Empire of 1877 to 1878. Within 1 year, Russian troops were nearing Constantinople and the Ottomans surrendered. Russia's nationalist diplomats and generals persuaded Alexander II to force the Ottomans to sign the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878. creating an enlarged, independent Bulgaria that stretched into the southwestern Balkans. Another significant result of the 1877–78 Russo-Turkish War in Russia's favor was the acquisition from the Ottomans of the provinces of Batumi, Ardahan, and Kars in the South Caucasus, which were transformed into the militarily administered regions of Batumi Oblast and Kars Oblast, to replace Muslim refugees who had fled across the new frontier into Ottoman territory. The Russian authorities settled large numbers of Christians from an ethnically diverse range of communities in Kars Oblast, particularly the Georgians, Caucasus Greeks, and Armenians, all of whom hoped to achieve their own regional ambitions on the back of the Russian Empire. When Britain threatened to declare war over the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano, an exhausted Russia backed down. At the Congress of Berlin in July 1878, Russia agreed to the creation of a smaller Bulgaria. Russian nationalists were furious with Austria-Hungary and Germany for failing to back Russia, but the Tsar accepted a revived and strengthened League of the Three Emperors as well as Austro-Hungarian hegemony in the Western Balkans. Russian diplomatic and military interests subsequently refocused on Central Asia, where Russia had quelled a series of uprisings in the 1870s, and Russia incorporated hitherto independent emirates into the empire. Britain renewed its concerns in 1881 when Russian troops occupied Turkmen lands on the Persian and Afghan borders, but Germany lent diplomatic support to Russian advances, and an Anglo-Russian war was averted. Meanwhile, Russia's sponsorship of Bulgarian independence brought negative results as the Bulgarians, angry at Russia's continuing interference in domestic affairs, sought the support of Austria-Hungary. In the dispute that arose between Austria-Hungary and Russia, Germany took a firm position toward Russia while mollifying the Tsar with a bilateral defensive alliance. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 between Germany and Russia. Within a year, Russo-German acrimony led to Otto von Bismarck's forbidding further loans to Russia, and France replaced Germany as Russia's financier. When Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck in 1890, the loose Russo-Prussian Entente collapsed after having lasted for more than 25 years. 3 years later, Russia allied itself with France by entering into a joint military convention, which matched the dual alliance formed in 1879 by Germany and Austria-Hungary. Relations with Britain. Russophobia. From 1820 to 1907, a new element emerged. Russophobia. British elite sentiment turned increasingly hostile to Russia, with a high degree of anxiety for the safety of India, with the fear that Russia would push south through Afghanistan. In addition, there was a growing concern that Russia would destabilize Eastern Europe by its attacks on the faltering Ottoman Empire. This fear made the Eastern question a matter of high priority. Russia was especially interested in getting a warm water port that would enable its navy. Getting access out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean was a goal, which meant access through the straits controlled by the Ottomans. Russia intervened on behalf of Orthodox Greeks in the Greek War of Independence. The London Peace Treaty favored Greece but heightened Russophobia in Britain and France. In 1851, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations held in London's Crystal Palace, including over 100,000 exhibits from 40 nations. It was the world's first international exposition. Russia took the opportunity to dispel growing Russophobia by refuting stereotypes of Russia as a backward, militaristic, repressive tyranny. Its sumptuous exhibits of luxury products and large objets d'art with little in the way of advanced technology, however, did little to change its reputation. Britain considered its navy too weak to worry about, but saw its large army as a major threat. The Russian pressures on the Ottoman Empire continued, leaving Britain and France to ally with the Ottomans and push back against Russia in the Crimean War. Russophobia was an element in generating popular British and French support for the far-off war. Elite opinion in Britain, especially among liberals, supported Poles against harsh Russian rule. After 1830, the British government watched nervously as Russia suppressed revolts in the 1860s but refused to intervene. In 1874, tension lessened as Queen Victoria's second son married the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II, followed by a cordial state visit by the Tsar. The superficial goodwill lasted no more than 3 years when structural forces again pushed the two nations to the verge of war. The Great Game and Asian affairs rivalry between Britain and Russia grew steadily over Central Asia in the Great Game of the late 19th century. Russia desired warm water ports on the Indian Ocean, while Britain wanted to prevent Russian troops from gaining a potential invasion route to India. In 1885, Russia annexed part of Afghanistan in the Panjshir incident, which caused a war scare. However, Russia's Foreign Minister Nikolai Gurs and its ambassador to London Baron de Stael set up an agreement in 1887 which established a buffer zone in Central Asia. Russian diplomacy thereby won grudging British acceptance of its expansionism. Persia was also an arena of tension and was divided into spheres of influence without warfare. Russia followed the lead of the major powers in sending an occupation force to protect international subjects in China during the Boxer Rebellion. War with Japan over Korea 1904–1905. The Russo-Japanese War was fought over rival ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. Most international observers expected Russia to win easily over upstart Japan, and were astonished when Japan sank the main Russian fleet and won the war, marking the first great Asian victory over a modern European power. Russia sought a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean for its growing navy, and to expand maritime trade. Vladivostok was operational only during the summer, whereas Port Arthur, a naval base in Liaodong Province leased to Russia by China, was operational all year. Since the end of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, negotiations between Russia and Japan went nowhere. Japan was worried by Russia's long march east through Siberia and Central Asia, and offered to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of Korea as being within the Japanese sphere of influence. Tokyo placed a much higher value on Korea than did St. Petersburg, but Russia demanded Korea north of the 39th parallel to become a neutral buffer zone between Russia and Japan. While the Russian decision-makers were confused, Japan worked to isolate them diplomatically, especially by signing the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902. After negotiations collapsed in 1904, the Japanese Navy opened hostilities by attacking the Russian Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur in a surprise attack. Russia suffered numerous defeats, but Tsar Nicholas II was convinced that Russia would eventually win, so he refused to settle. The decisive battle came in May 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima, when the main Russian battle fleet, after sailing around the world, finally arrived off Korea and was sunk in a matter of hours. Peace came with the Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt. It was highly advantageous to Japan and transformed the balance of power in East Asia. Britain remained strictly neutral, as allowed by its treaty with Japan. However, there was a brief war scare in October 1905 when the Russian battle fleet headed to fight Japan mistakenly engaged a number of British fishing vessels in the North Sea. The misunderstanding was quickly resolved. approach of the First World War. Diplomacy became delicate in the early 20th century. Russia was troubled by the Entente Cordiale between Great Britain and France signed in 1904. Russia and France already had a mutual defense agreement that said France was obliged to threaten England with an attack if Britain declared war on Russia, while Russia was to concentrate more than 300,000 troops on the Afghan border for an incursion into India in the event that England attacked France. The solution was to bring Russia into the British-French alliance, the Anglo-Russian Entente and the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 made both countries part of the Triple Entente. France and Russia, joined at the last moment by Britain, fought as allies of World War I against Germany and Austria in the First World War. In the summer of 1914, Austria threatened Serbia, Russia promised to help Serbia, Germany promised to help Austria, and war broke out between Russia and Germany. France supported Russia. Britain was neutral until Germany suddenly invaded neutral Belgique. Then Britain joined France and Russia in World War I against Germany and Austria. Historians continue to debate how much responsibility for the war was due to Russia's support for Serbia when the small Orthodox nation was pressured by Germany.